Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. History seems once again to be repeating itself. This time it's Donald Trump, his taking on the Pope. There was an interesting piece in Politico. From Attila the Hun to Donald Trump, a brief history of the Pope's battling world leaders. You might throw in Henry VIII there and many other world leaders. And of course, there is a historical resonance, some of it slightly absurd, much of it very disturbing about the most recent war in Iran, or America's war in Iran. My old friend Peter Wehner, one of America's most conscientious, both in moral and intellectual terms, writers, commentators, particularly on Trump, has a very interesting new piece in The Atlantic, Hegseth's Holy War, Hegseth being, of course, the Minister of War in the Trump regime. Pete argues that the defense secretary seems less interested in being on the side of God than on insisting that God is on his side. And it always seems to me as if Hegseth is a bit of a crusader. Pete, welcome back to the show. Always nice to see you. Is history repeating itself? Is this latest episode of American involvement in the Middle East, is it just one more chapter in the history of the Crusades?
Well, what's the line that if it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. I do think, given who Pete Hegseth is, who we know him to be, that there is probably an element of the Crusades within his framework. I think that's driving some of what he's interested in. I think it goes deeper than that too. I think it's probably tied, as it relates to Pete Hegseth, to his psychology. I think he's working out a lot of issues, unresolved issues, and those are challenging enough for an individual. It's a lot more serious if you happen to be Secretary of Defense and have a lot of weapons at your disposal. But there's a kind of bloodlust with Pete Hegseth. I think he has very clear stated resentments. If you read his book that he had toward the military, when he served there in Iraq, he felt like he was mistreated. He's a person who is MAGA mindset, I think, in an authentic rather than a cynical way. And so I think a lot of who he is as a person is playing itself out. But part of that is that he's become associated with a movement that's run by a pastor named Doug Wilson, which is fairly radical, I would say malicious in many respects. And so I think he is justifying a lot of what he is doing in the name of Jesus, even though I think in the process he's defaming the authentic name of Jesus.
You wrote another piece on Hegseth a couple of weeks ago in The Atlantic, Pete Hegseth's moral unseriousness. At least that was what the Atlantic editor chose to headline it. I mean, how much seriousness should we give to a guy like Hegseth, Pete? You noted that there seems to be, you put it in your own very polite way, he's working out some things about himself. Someone like myself might put it in slightly less polite terms. But, I mean, he strikes me as just if we want to talk about the Crusades, as a very low-level crusader from the 10th or the 11th century, the kind of guy who would get drunk and go in and rape and pillage Constantinople or Jerusalem or wherever else he happened to turn up in. How much seriousness? I want to come to Trump in a few minutes. We've had many conversations on Trump. But for you, are you sort of torn between, on the one hand, dismissing any kind of claims to morality, as opposed to critiquing whatever religious high ground he claims?
Yeah, it's a good question. To your first question, I'd say that he is unserious as a person, but he holds a serious position. If he weren't Secretary of Defense, or as he likes to refer to himself as Secretary of War, Yeah, I wouldn't spend any time on him. I think he's certainly an intellectual lightweight, a person who doesn't seem to be acquainted with ideas in any regard. And that way, he's very Trumpian, very fits very easily into the MAGA universe. So I think I think he's light as air in many respects. But Trump appointed him Secretary of Defense, and that has a certain gravity to it, as we're seeing in terms of the morality and how serious should we take his take on faith and morality. I mean, to some measure, I think we need to, again, because of the position he holds. But in that respect, I think that is indicative of a broader phenomenon, right? Something has gone terribly wrong with faith and culture, the intersection of faith, culture, faith, and politics. And we need to understand that, because a lot of damage is being done by people who claim to be Christian. And I think Hegseth is an avatar of a certain kind of person. There's a whole spectrum of people who are doing damage. He's one of them. I think his conversion, I don't know him, I've never met him, so I'm speaking here from afar. My hunch is his conversion is at least in part real. He thinks it's real. And I think what he is doing is he's using scripture to validate his bloodlust and to affirm things that he already believes. Now that happens to a lot of people all the time, but I think this has a fairly particular manifestation. And again, I think that's tied to the movement that he's a part of. I think because his life is dissolute, he has searched for ways to try and bring it together. And I think he's locked in on a particular brand of faith to do that.
In terms of American history, he's a very different kind of character. Say, for example, to Robert McNamara, who became the poster child for the moral catastrophe in Vietnam, who ran forward, was a Harvard graduate, really smart, very serious. Hegseth seems the reverse of someone like McNamara.
Oh, I think that's right. What were they? The whiz kids, I think they were referred to during the Kennedy years, and
the best. And I mean, of course, the phrase "the best and the brightest." I'm not sure if he was in that book, but if he wasn't, he could have been.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And John F. Kennedy had a very high regard for McNamara. It was among the people that I think he had the highest regard for. I think it was true to some extent of at least the early Bobby Kennedy. I don't, when RFK turned against the Vietnam War, which was a sort of the mid 60s, 66, something like that. You'll know more than I do because you're working on a book on him. But they had a very high regard for McNamara, as you said. He was the Ford Foundation, was esteemed academically and elsewhere. As it turned out with Vietnam, he made some key analytical errors. Probably came to believe things, wishful thinking, and then there was the issue of deception as the Vietnam War unfolded, and whether they were actually reporting facts on the ground in a way that was accurate. So McNamara was a story of, I don't know, more of a Greek tragedy element.
Yeah, and we've actually even done shows. There was a recent biography of McNamara.
Yeah.
I like your phrase, Pete. I mean, you've probably said it before, certainly to yourself, if not to me. Something has gone terribly wrong. You write very much from a religious perspective. You're doing a wonderful series in the New York Times on interviews, conversations with distinguished theologians. You have a recent one with David Bentley Hart on why Hart is he's not an atheist because he thinks that the philosophical arguments against it are unanswerable. For serious religious figures like yourself, what can you do about someone like Hegseth, who claims to be religious? As you kind of know, you can't prove he isn't. You can't prove that he doesn't sit at night and commune with God. What are we supposed to make of? I mean, Trump is another example, although I don't think he's quite as morally callous as Hegseth, at least in terms of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, one thing that I think can be done and needs to be done is that individuals who have a different interpretation, understanding of the Christian faith need to speak out. And there's been way too much silence among certainly evangelical Christians. in my view. The Pope, who's Catholic, obviously, has taken a different approach, and he's confronted Trump in moral terms, and so it's a very fascinating battle that is shaping up there. But among evangelicals, I think far too many people who know better, who will privately tell you that they're horrified by what Trump and Hegseth are, what they stand for, their use of validating their actions and approach and cruelty and crudity in the name of Christianity really bothers them. But far too many of them are afraid to speak out. It's a complicated issue as to why, but I think fear for themselves, fear that their congregations will split. And why is that? Well, because there are a number of people, a lot of people, as we know from the data, white evangelicals who voted for Trump and very much on board. But there are a whole group of people, Franklin Graham and Eric Metaxas and Tony Perkins and Mike Huckabee and Robert Jeffress. I mean, I could go through a list of people who claim to be followers of Jesus, claim to be evangelicals, who are very vocal Trump supporters. And that, to me, is a defamation of Jesus. It's a defamation of the Christian faith. I do what I can as a follower of Jesus, imperfect one for sure, but I do what I can to try and be true to what I believe. And I believe what they're doing is a distortion, almost a kind of Nietzschean will to power, turning, it's a transvaluation of values. And the fact that this is not self-evident is just a striking thing. And I suppose it reinforces a belief that I've increasingly had as I've gotten older, which is the way to understand human life and politics is much more through the prism of psychology and human emotions than rationality, or in this case, serious theology.
I know you're not really a historian so much of the church, but and I didn't ask this question before, so you might not be prepared for it, Pete. But when it came to the Crusades, for example, which
Right.
still remains probably the great moral stain on the Christian church, on the Catholic Church, and the way in
Right.
which the Crusaders behaved, were there attempts by the theological establishment of one kind or another to sometimes distance themselves from 10th, 11th century characters like Hegseth, who just claimed to be Christian and behaved in an absurdly violent and gross way in the name of God and the church? I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
in a way, that's also the foundations of the Lutheran reaction against Catholicism. Is there a potentially a kind of schismatic quality to what's happening these days?
Yeah, it's a good and it's a deep question. I mean, I think that there were voices historically, but I think certain wrong turns were taken throughout Christianity, and it's overly simplifies it. But Constantine in the 4th century, that I think ended up being pretty costly. It's interesting if you study church history, right? The early Christian church spread like wildfire. And we're talking about from the time of Christ, really up until, right around the time of Constantine. It didn't have political power. In some respects, it didn't have cultural power. In other respects, it did. But it was the power of the witness of Christian lives and Christian community, especially toward the dispossessed, the people who were viewed as the sort of bottom of the barrel of society. In my interview with David Bentley Hart, who's an extraordinary mind, including his knowledge of the patristics, the early church fathers, that was what was so revolutionary about what Jesus summoned into the human consciousness, which was a particular care for and love for the people who were aliens and sojourners. When Christians manifest that in their lives, it had a tremendously powerful effect. It's why part of the reason why the faith spread the way it did. Once Christianity became associated with power, it started to make accommodations, moral accommodations and other accommodations, which really hurt the faith. And then what happens is that the state wants to control the church. This happened obviously with Nazism, both with the Protestant church and the Catholic church. and to make deals. And the church makes the deal because they think, well, we'll get favorable treatment from the state, or we're not persecuted by the state. But then the state demands certain allegiance to what it believes. There have been voices throughout, whether it's the Inquisition or the Crusades, moments of awful anti-Semitism, where people would speak out. But my understanding, and I'm not a church historian, but that's rare. And the reason it was rare is because there was fear. It was that the institution would turn, in a very different realm. Andrew, if you look at geocentrism and heliocentrism, right, whether the earth revolves around the sun or sun around the earth, there was a very deep commitment. And in this case, people who grounded their beliefs in scripture that said, no, the sun has to revolve around the earth. There are verses in Psalms and elsewhere that prove it. That's what they argued. So when Copernicus and Galileo came along and questioned it, what happened? Well, they got into a lot of trouble with church authority. So this is not new, what we're going through. Whether we're at a point of a schism now, I would say, I don't know, but I would say that the evangelical church is going through some real convulsive moments right now, and something that's going to emerge out of it is different than what we've seen in the past. But what the evangelical church stands for today, by and large, is, I think, an awful depiction of the Christian faith, and I think that it's net more of a negative than a positive contribution to our civic life and to American politics.
Yes, it's clearly happened before. At the beginning of your piece on Atlantic, in the Atlantic, you quote Shakespeare, of course, who was writing during the Reformation. I mean, should Christians of all types, from Roman Catholics to people like yourself, should you get together and say, look, you evangelicals, you can do whatever you like and say whatever you like, but we don't want you using the C word.
Yeah.
Invent another word. Go somewhere else. In the same way, I guess, in a sense, the Catholic Church said in the 16th century.
Right.
Is that? I mean, I know it sounds rather absurd, but is it conceivable, Pete, that at a certain point, Christians, to borrow some language from Marx, Christians of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your name or your faith. I mean, at a certain point, you have to say to these people, we just don't want any association in name or tradition with you.
Yeah, no, it's a very fair question. I mean, you have historically something called the Barmen Declaration, which Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a part of, and that's precisely what happened. Niemöller, to some extent Karl Barth, but Bonhoeffer most particularly broke with the Protestant church in Germany, and said, no, this is not what we stand for. Now, there have been people many times in different moments that have tried to replicate the Barmen Declaration. That was sui generis because of the circumstances of Nazism. And there are people, I have a close friend, Mark Laverton, former president of Fuller Theological Seminary, who helped write and signed and urged others to sign a statement in the aftermath of what happened in Minneapolis when the two killings from the ICE agents took place. And people signed that and actually went and came to gather in Minneapolis for protests. And that made a difference. That galvanized the conscience of the country, and ICE backed down and Trump backed down. That was one of the few good news stories of resistance that we've seen during the Trump era. I'm completely in favor of it. I will tell you, Andrew, that I think one thing that is different now than in the past, and that complicates the equation, is that there's been such a loss of authority across the board in virtually every institution. This is not specific only to America, but it's true certainly in America. And you do not have the kind of authoritative voices that you did, right? 60 years ago, if Billy Graham would have taken a stand, or somebody like John Stott, who's a very significant figure in the evangelical world, or, going back earlier than that to, say, C.S. Lewis, figures like that. If they would have spoken out, that would carry weight. You just don't have those kind of figures now. And that's not true only of Christianity or religion. It's true of intellectuals, right? When William F. Buckley, and I wasn't a particular Buckley fan, but if Buckley spoke out in the 60s or even in the 90s when he basically said Pat Buchanan has to be excommunicated from conservatism because of his anti-Semitism, there were people who had authority that could say that, and people would listen to them. Today, because of the massive mistrust that exists along almost all institutions, there aren't those kind of figures who could speak out and command that sort of moral authority.
Well, something has gone terribly wrong when it comes to moral authority. I don't know anyone in America who has more of it and has been braver in expressing themselves from the earliest times of the Trump administration, Trump 1, Trump 2, than Pete Wehner. Pete, we're going to take a short break, and then I want to come back and talk about not Hegseth, but Trump and the Pope. So hold on, everyone. We'll be back in 2 seconds. This is not a commercial break. That's because we don't have commercials on this show. I'm not going to waste your time trying to sell you inane products. However, I do have a pretty good deal for you. I'm writing a book about the United States. It's due out in 2028. And if you become a paid subscriber on my Keen on America Substack, you'll not only get very cool notes and photographs and videos from this project, but I'll also send you a personalized signed copy of the book when it comes out in 2028. So go to keenon.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. That's keenon.substack.com. And now back to our conversation. We're speaking with Pete Wehner. I was going to say Pete Hegseth. That would be terrible, Pete. Author of Hegseth's Unholy War. Pete, we spent the first half of the show talking about Hegseth, crusades, excommunicating guys like Hegseth. The man who has done more, perhaps, than anyone, certainly in this latest chapter on the Iran war, is the Pope. Even Catholic Trump supporters apparently feel conflicted over the president's tiff with the Pope, according to CNN. I think it's more than a tiff. One might describe it as an intellectual war. CNN argues that Leo's target is bigger than just Trump. He's rebuking what they call the MAGA Jesus. What do you make, Pete, as a very careful observer of religious life, of what the Pope is doing? Is this spontaneous? Has it been planned?
I don't think it's spontaneous. I think this is being thought through pretty carefully. My sense of Pope Leo, who I don't know, but an observer from afar, and also how the Catholic Church works, I don't think that this is him riffing, if you will. To some extent, his predecessor Francis did. I don't think Leo tends to do that. I think it's a pretty important moment, and I agree with you. I don't think this should be seen exclusively or even primarily through the frame of the Iran war. I think that's a proximate cause for the conflict, but I think it's been brewing for a while, and Pope Leo has been making statements for a while, and it's significant that he's an American Pope, of course, that's been setting down some markers. And I think that this has the elements of quite a drama around it, for what I think are fairly obvious reasons, but just to state them. I mean, you have a man who is moral pitted against a man who's amoral and immoral. You have a person of faith against a person of no faith. You have a person representing an institution in Leo in the Catholic Church versus a person who loves to destroy institutions and has no affiliation, no regard for institutions or their traditions. And then you have a person who uses his language and his rhetoric with care and does not personalize or dehumanize, even as he disagrees with people in Pope Leo, versus Donald Trump, who is very much the opposite. He's a person who can't help but dehumanize his critics and his opponents, and who seems to thrive on conflict. So I think those are some of the elements that makes this, quite an important moment. Apart from the fact that you have the most important religious leader and the most well-known religious leader in the world in the Pope, versus the most powerful person and probably the most well-known person in the world in Donald Trump. So I think this is it's a big deal, and I don't think it's going to dissipate anytime soon. Knowing Donald Trump and even his reactions to some of the criticisms from the Pope, this isn't a fight that he's going to be inclined to avoid.
Yeah, The Hill ran a piece about the holy war America needed, a war of the Pope, perhaps against certain kinds of morality. Do you agree? I mean, is the Pope really the only person of unblemished moral authority who can take on Trump and Hegseth and all these other outlaws? Some people might even consider them criminals, certainly when it comes to war crimes these days in Iran.
Yeah. He's not the only one, but I think he's the person, for institutional reasons, that he's the most obvious one, and that's why I'm glad that he's speaking out the way he is. It just has the drama of a single person pitted against another person, even though obviously Pope Leo represents the Catholic Church. So he's the most important moral voice I could think of. Quite honestly, there's just not many other moral voices that I could see doing it either because those voices have been to varying degrees corrupted. Somebody like, say, a Franklin Graham, who's the son of Billy Graham, significant within the evangelical world, has become just a bootlicker for Donald Trump to absurd degrees, and is doing enormous harm to the gospel of Christ. Again, in the name of Christ. I don't think he's cynical about it. I think the poor man is just deluded beyond belief. But there aren't those kind of figures in America that seem willing or able to stand up. So there's Pope Leo, and he's doing it. So all honored and credit to him.
Does it sometimes perhaps suggest to you should cash in your theological chips? You might not quite be a Catholic, but ultimately all these religious groups comes down in some ways to politics, and that even a guy like yourself, who's been a continual moral thorn in the side of the Trump regime right from 2015, you're one of the very first people to warn us about what was going to happen, Pete. You've been pretty much accurate on most of the stuff you've written and predicted and warned us about, that you should just join in, become a Catholic, not worry so much on the theology and focus on the politics.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I should say just my own personality. I've never been much of a joiner, and denominations have not been central to my walk of faith. For some people, it's a very big deal. It hasn't been for me. The Catholic Church, I think, has a lot to commend and a lot to apologize for as well. Theologically, I'm not quite there, but I'm not quite theologically in the evangelical world either. I'm in many. Sometimes I just feel like I'm slightly in my own world, borrowing bits and pieces from different theological traditions. Some from Catholicism, some from Eastern Orthodox, some from evangelicalism. I don't know that, in fact, I'm quite sure that me joining the Catholic Church or not joining the Catholic Church would have no impact at all. I'm making the critiques that I make, and I make them whether I'm a Catholic or a non-Catholic. I try and write in a way and present myself in a way that the critiques kind of stand on their own, whether they're rooted in faith or in political philosophy or just moral common sense. And I think that probably determines the degree to which it has resonance, or it's persuasive or not. So I think if I join the Catholic Church, it wouldn't make the Catholic Church any stronger. I don't think it would make my argument any stronger or weaker. I'm just trying to, I'm a pilgrim and a sojourner trying to figure out my way through faith, and even in that theological series that you refer to that I do in the Times, and some of the essays on faith that I've written. And the truth is, I'm working out some issues that and questions and doubts that I have too. I have a lot of them. That's just the way I'm hardwired. And I'm not worried about airing those things in public. I'm interested in having those conversations and trying to ascertain the truth as best I can. And often that involves talking to people who are smarter than I and who hold views that are different than mine and are part of traditions that are different than mine.
One person who did join the Catholic Church, who probably regrets it now, is J.D. Vance. He said that, warning the Pope, the head of the church that he's the member of, and he may be flirting with excommunication too, that the Pope, quote unquote, should be more careful when talking about theology. I'm not quite sure what he means. I mean, what do you make of Vance? He's not quite a charlatan like Hegseth. He's not a low-level crusader going around rampaging, pillaging, looting, and raping. He's more of a, I don't know, how would you describe him historically? He's not coming out of this looking very good, I don't think.
No, I don't think he's looking good at all. In terms of understanding J.D. Vance, I would say that he's more cynical and less of a true believer than Hegseth. I think that his conversion to MAGA world and to Trump was transparently cynical and tied to an enormous ambition for power. So in some ways, I hold him more morally culpable than a kind of true believer, say somebody like a Marjorie Taylor Greene or somebody like that.
In that sense, there's a sort of a Shakespearean quality, if that's the right word, to Vance.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think he's a particularly impressive figure. I don't think he's a particularly beloved figure in MAGA world either. His own journey has taken some interesting turns, in terms of his conversion to Catholicism, and he's really become burrowed into various subcultures within the Catholic world that I think are troublesome. I do wonder with Vance and others too, Andrew, that over time they make these moves cynically. It's driven by cynicism, but there's a line that you become the mask that you wear. And I think that's partly because psychologically, the pain of cognitive dissonance, the pain that most people have who are not sociopathic, to live a life that is at odds with what you really and truly believe, or if you embrace immorality and unethical conduct and unethical attitudes that are that creates for most people a lot of internal tension. And so you try and mitigate that tension. Your mind tries to mitigate that tension, and you begin to rationalize what you believe, and you begin to believe what you say. And I imagine with Vance, some of that is going on. And then you have an echo chamber, the kind of people that he surrounds himself, who I'm sure are affirming many of his worst instincts and some of his worst theological attitudes. But look, at the end of the day, I would say Vance is like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, and you go down the list. These are people who knew better. They're cowards, essentially. They decided to make a figurative deal with the devil. They justified it to themselves. They convinced themselves probably that being close to power and positions of power, they could do more harm than good, that they could mitigate the worst tendencies of Trump.
You mean more good than harm?
Or more, yeah, sorry. They could do more good.
That was a Freudian error, Pete.
Yeah. Let me put it this way. I don't think they're worried about their harm that they're doing in the name of good. I think that's probably pretty obvious at this point. The betting right now, and it's way too early, is that J.D. Vance would be the favorite to replace Donald Trump whenever Trump leaves the scene. I'm not quite as convinced. I mean, he has obvious institutional advantages, but I don't think he's a particularly compelling figure. And as I said earlier, I don't even know that he's that compelling in MAGA world. We'll see what plays out. But my hope is that there is a comeuppance for Vance and for a lot of his Trump followers. By the way, it's just apropos that you've seen recently that Tucker Carlson is now apologizing to his listeners on his podcast for having made the case to reelect Trump, which is, I think, notable. Tucker Carlson is an abhorrent figure, I think, in a lot of ways. But I do think that this is interesting because I think what it signifies is that there is a crack up. There's obviously a crack up in the MAGA movement. We see that playing out virtually every day from different quadrants within MAGA world. But you're also seeing figures who are now willing to break with Trump. And I think that's because he has the stench of being a loser. And I think
and you wrote an excellent piece on this with John Rauch, another old friend of the show. You and he have often contributed in the New York Times, always writing particularly appropriate, timely pieces. You believe now that the Trump administration is in a psychotic state. I mean, it always seems to be in a somewhat psychotic state. What makes it particularly psychotic? Is its weakness? Is it cracking up, Pete?
I think it is cracking up. The case that John and I made, and John was really the key person in this particular essay. He was the one that had the best insight, and so I want to make sure that I say that. I'd say that the difference between Trump 1.0 and 2.0 is exactly that, the psychotic state. That is, that Trump, even in the first administration, while he was problematic and did things that I think were troubling, there were some guardrails, whether you're talking about people like General Milley or John Kelly or others that were in the Trump orbit that didn't allow him to get away with some of his most bizarre and insane ideas and impulses. Trump 2.0 is very, very different. And Trump was intentional about that. And he really had a chokehold on the key institutions, CIA, DOJ, FBI, Department of Justice. And he's filled them with lackeys and sort of, hoodlums and stooges, to advance his cause. But what's happened is that the psychosis that I think Trump is quite obviously dealing with and has for many years is now going outward and downward, and really infecting the federal government in ways that it didn't in 1.0. And so the administration itself, we saw this with the Iran war, which, whatever you think about the merits of going to war with Iran, and there was a case that could be made. I'm not sure it was a persuasive case, but there was a serious case that could be made. But the way that this was done and executed and explained or not explained, you can just see the chaos. It's just like utter insanity. It's a kind of thing that you wouldn't expect from a group of middle schoolers planning an operation, let alone people of the federal government. And so the state itself has become psychotic, disoriented, and unable to operate within reality. And that has a tremendous cost, as we're seeing. And I think, by the way, Andrew, what is now happening is that Trump is colliding against a world he cannot shape and will not bend to his will. It happened with NATO. It's happening now with Iran. And my fear with Donald Trump is that he's going to have what psychologists call an extinction burst, which refers to often with children with disordered personalities. When they lose control of situations, they can't control what they're used to controlling, or they are used to getting away with things, and then say parents or authorities, school authorities or others say, no, you can't do it. There's what's referred to as an extinction burst, which is this anger and outrage and because of the loss of control, they become out of control.
Yeah, and as any parent, you're a parent, I'm a parent, we all know what it's like dealing with an out of control 5-year-old. In that excellent piece that you wrote with John, you end by saying that the Iran war has most vividly demonstrated the scope of the problem of this breakdown of the psychotic state. Thinking out loud, John, thinking out loud, Pete, what's happening is that Trump now is facing a pincer attack from, on the one hand, the Muslim, the Shiite theological regime in Tehran, and on the other hand, the Pope. It's bizarre. Who else in the history of the world has united both Islam and Rome, Shiism and Roman Catholicism?
Well, there you go. It turns out Donald Trump has this capacity to bring the world together in a way that no previous historical figure did. He's a healer of the breach.
Yeah, even Shakespeare couldn't have done it. Even Shakespeare wouldn't have come up with this narrative. So it's coming to an end. I hope, at least we all hope. I'm sure most people listening to this and watching this hope. What's going to be the outcome, Pete, for the few? I mean, there's always these pieces on Trump religious supporters, Catholics or otherwise, feeling conflicted. But will there be blood spilt after this shameful episode comes to an end? What's going to happen to your evangelicals? They're not your evangelicals, but these evangelicals that you've been criticizing so loudly for the last 12 years.
Yeah, I'm going to be very curious to see what plays out, Andrew. I don't know. Some of them will probably pretend that they never did what they did. Some of them will explain it away, probably like Tucker Carlson, apologize and seek to move on. I don't imagine many of them are going to search their souls for what they did and confront why they did it, because I think it would be, I think they would peer into something very dark and something that they just don't want to believe about themselves. I think a lot of them will opt for what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, just to use an evangelical word, repent and move on. Some of them will explain away what they did by saying, well, of course we did. We were never fully comfortable with him, but the left was an existential threat to everything that we know and love. And so, he was the only available option. So I think a lot of those rationalizations are going to go on. I will say that their witness on behalf of what they claim to care most about, which is Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and the fact that for Christians that he's the Christ figure, that's been just decimated. And to a watching world has seen this unfold, and they look at these evangelicals and say, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. You act worse than the people you criticize.
Yeah, and I think there must be stronger words than hypocrite.
Yeah,
I don't know what the word is. Probably it's a family show. We can't use it. But hypocrisy doesn't cover it sufficiently.
Yeah, no, look, they've done tremendous damage, and they've done it knowingly and then unknowingly. It's been a combination. I hope there's a comeuppance for it. I hope there's accountability.
Well, there always is, Pete. I mean, you have a theological mindset, one way or the other, and with a little bit of Shakespeare thrown in. That's inevitable, isn't it? In the history of our species, you never get out of these things completely.
I agree with you. I mean, I think ultimately history gets it more or less right, and this is a pretty easy one for history to get right. These people were on the wrong side of their faith. They were on the wrong side of morality. They were on the wrong side of politics. They were on the wrong side of justice, and they're going to be known to have been on the wrong side of those things. The interesting question to me is whether that's going to be known not 100 years from now, but 5 years from now. I imagine it will. I think that this Trumpian moment is breaking apart. Now, how it ends, there are real concerns, but it is breaking apart. And my belief has long been that in the end, truth and reality assert themselves. They can't be subordinated forever. And the truth will out, and that this story will be told, and it'll be told more or less in the way it should be told, accurately. And a lot of these people that I've named on the show, including others like Al Mohler, are going to be figures who are, I think, reviled in a lot of ways for what they did, and for the immorality that they promoted.
And in the name of
name of Jesus, and that name means a lot.
If there is indeed an afterlife, they may burn for a long time. A couple more questions, Pete, before we have to go. You're always very generous with your time. You're talking to me from McLean in Virginia, not far from the CIA, from the heart of military America, from the Pentagon. Hegseth has been more and more involved in, and Vance, but particularly Hegseth, in disputes, conflicts with the military, with senior military figures. I know you're not a military guy, but my guess is that there is a deep distaste for what these people are doing within
100%.
senior military figures.
100%. Yeah, that is absolutely true. I know people who are high-ranking in the military. I think it's hard to overstate how much contempt they have for Hegseth, how much harm that they think that he is doing. And I think that they are thinking very, very hard about what can be done to contain the damage and to contain Hegseth if he flies off the handle, including military orders. I mean, Hegseth and Trump talk openly about war crimes, celebration of war crimes, and that is something that if you know virtually anybody in the military, high-ranking, that is an anathema to them. They care very much for morality. They spend much of their life and career trying to think through how can we be an effective military force, kill when we have to kill, but to do it within the traditions of just war and within the boundaries of morality and the parameters of morality. Those aren't easy questions. People make mistakes, but at least these are people of enormous moral seriousness and distinguished thinkers and human beings. And they help build the American military into what it has become, which is an extraordinary force. But there was an accountability within the military and as I say, a moral seriousness. And to see somebody like Hegseth and Trump just come along and pour kerosene and light matches and speak and celebrate, war crimes. I mean, Hegseth's history is, what did he do? In Trump's first term, he basically lobbied Trump to get people who were convicted of war crimes off and succeeded in doing that. So that's what you're dealing with. And so this drama, we've talked about the drama of the Pope and Trump, but do you very much have this drama, Pete Hegseth against the highest ranks of the military? And they're smart people, and they're good people, and they're effective people. And I hope they carry the day. And I wouldn't be surprised if Hegseth has a relatively early exit in any
I mean,
event.
I've been saying for a while now that he'll be gone by Christmas.
I think so.
Finally, Pete, if there is all this accounting, I guarantee you, if the regime, as you and John are suggesting, is in a psychotic state, and it does really just melt down at some point, maybe Trump will be carted off to an insane asylum. Who knows what will happen over the next year or two. There will be many, many articles about the end of the Republican Party, finish, blah, blah, blah. You're an old Republican. You got involved in all this with Reagan. You and I had many conversations about this. You worked in the Bush administration. How two final easy questions for you, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, many more times in the months to come. How accountable is the Republican Party for this? And does it have a future? I mean, what has to happen for the Republican Party to have a genuine future? I mean, it's not the Nazi Party, but it's certainly, there is a terrible moral stain on it when all this ends.
Oh, absolutely. It's hugely accountable for what's happened. It couldn't have happened without the Republican Party. Trump, I would say this about Trump. He's sociopathic. He clearly has a disordered personality. That should have been obvious to everybody for most of his life, certainly when he ran for office. I don't think he sees things in moral categories, as you and I have talked about before. I think he's colorblind when it comes to morality. He doesn't know any better. The Republican Party and the people in the Republican Party did know better, and they still went along with it. You take a guy like Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, very big on proclaiming his evangelical faith. he's a pathetic and disreputable figure. His reputation has been stained beyond belief because of how he's acted. Those are the people, and there is just a range of them. From Vance and Josh Hawley to Lindsey Graham to you go down to Rubio, we talked about earlier. These people were all complicit in an extraordinarily cruel and malicious political movement, which has done enormous damage to the ideals that they said they cared about, to the country they said that they loved, and to the world in which they inhabit. They are unbelievably accountable for this, and they're absolutely complicit. In terms of the future of the Republican Party, I mean, that remains to be seen if it has, any association with the current iteration of the Republican Party. Then it deserves condemnation.
Could you ever imagine going back?
Well, I could imagine it. I suppose if it became a fundamentally different party, if it repudiated what happened, and new figures, authentic new figures, came in who tried to rebuild it. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed in principle to that. I have no interest in going to the Republican Party in any time in the foreseeable future because of what it's done to the country and to the ideals that I care about, to the faith that I care about, but also because I think there's the remnants of the MAGA movement are going to continue. You're not going to have any kind of snapback or fundamentally new party for the foreseeable future. The roots of MAGA go much too deep. The fact that Trump might end up disintegrating will be good in some respects, but those MAGA sensibilities that have been built and the whole infrastructure that has been built up around Trump and MAGA world is not going away. And in fact, this could get more chaotic after Trump leaves than less chaotic. And I think this is, this may be some version of what happened after the French Revolution, when a revolution eats its own. We're seeing that happen now as I said earlier, on an almost daily basis, as one MAGA figure goes ferociously after another. So look, for the time being, I think the Republican Party is a horrifying political party that's done tremendous damage, and people should say it, and they should say it more, and they should keep saying it until there's some fundamental break with what it has become, which is a dark force on American life.
There you have it. The Republican Party has become horrifying. Something has gone terribly wrong in America. No one's been telling us this with more authority, I think, or consistency than Peter Wehner over the last decade. Pete, as always, great to have you on the show, and I'm sure this drama still has, for better or worse, a series of chapters left. We will talk in the near future. Keep well, keep safe, and keep speaking out. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's always a delight and interesting to talk to you. Thanks.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.